The greatest lie that people are told about the Enlightenment is that it was about science and reason. When people say this, they wield the terms science and reason as magical abracadabra words, words of propaganda, as if just by saying these two words, listeners are supposed to be stupefied with awe. As any real student of philosophy knows, this is patently false. Greek and Christian philosophy were already involved with both of these issues. Rather, Enlightenment philosophy is about a particular kind of science and a particular kind of reason and rationality. Practical science and practical reason. A science and reason that was related to the material world rather than the human subject. Francis Bacon's Novum Organum is the classic explanation of this outlook. Modern philosophy turned away from the inward questions of Christianity and to the outward questions of the material world. The goal, as Francis Bacon said, was to create the empire of man and bring about the relief of man's estate, purely practical purposes for human life. What separates modern science from Greek science is the belief in the transformation of nature. At face value, Greek rationalism and modern rationalism seem to be the same. They are both about the outward observation of nature. But the big difference is in their understanding of nature. If you recall from our covering of Greek philosophy, Greek philosophical rationality and its outward observations made humans part of nature. Humanity and nature were one. This is what Aristotle and especially the Stoics taught. We are outgrowths of nature and grow into our nature over time. This is what classical teleology is about. Modern philosophy, and thus modern science, rejects this. Through human will, practical science, industry, commerce, in other words, technology, humans can remake the world, remake nature, and ultimately remake ourselves for a comfortable and secure existence in a world that is often nasty, brutish, and short. Thus, modern philosophy marks the separation of man from nature, creating the perennial problem that future modern philosophy wrestled with, the crisis of dualism. Modern philosophy also asserts that nature is malleable, changeable, and is in no way fixed, as it was in Greek philosophy. We can ultimately change our nature to our own liking. You are probably familiar with these ideas because you probably believe them too. When Bacon proclaimed the new science and new philosophy as aiming to achieve the relief of man's estate, he drew on the theologies of vocation from Martin Luther and John Calvin, both of whom proclaimed that fidelity to God was active labor in this life. What becomes clear then, when entering the modern era of philosophy, is the practical turn away from the contemplative philosophies of the Greeks and medieval Christian traditions. Rational contemplation of the outer world of nature was now the high philosophical pursuit of the Greeks, and the contemplation of the inner world of the human heart was then the highest philosophical pursuit of Christianity, but with the modern rationalism of the Enlightenment. It is the rational inquiry into how more efficiently and more easily to achieve the things that the body needs to survive and thrive that becomes the highest pursuit of philosophy. Thomas Hobbes, a later contemporary of Francis Bacon, declared reason and rationality simply to be the rational calculation to more easily and efficiently obtain these bodily needs. John Locke, who followed Hobbes, also argued for practical philosophy in his writings, especially the two treatises, where he articulated the vision of man as homo economicus, man, the rational economic agent, doing everything purely for economic purposes. Both Thomas Hobbes and John Locke followed Francis Bacon in this regard. As mentioned, while there are superficial similarities between modern philosophical rationalism and classical Greek philosophical rationalism, the differences should now become more apparent to you. Greek rationalism was contemplative, intellectual. Modern rationalism is pragmatic and practical. Greek rationalism believed nature to be fixed and that we are products of a fixed nature. Modern rationalism believes nature to be fluid and changeable. Greek rationalism wanted to know about ourselves through the study of nature. Modern rationalism wants to make our life comfortable through the transformation of nature. The Greek understanding of reason is grounded in contemplative thought. Modern rationalism sees the purpose of reason as leading to practical action. In short, modern philosophy is all about the body, while Greek philosophy is all about an attempt to understand ourselves in relationship to the world. Modern philosophy, therefore, becomes practical science. This is something all students of philosophy come to learn through the study of the history of philosophy. This is something that we ought to realize and recognize how profound this transformation is. The movement of modern philosophy to becoming practical science is what allows imbeciles like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins and so many more practical scientists who wield the term science as an abracadabra word to belittle philosophy, even though philosophy is what gave birth to their discipline of modern science, practical science. Modern philosophy, beginning with Francis Bacon, is about the scientific conquest and control of nature. A little bit later, another famous English philosopher emerged. He was a philosopher before he was remembered as a scientist, Isaac Newton. Newton's discovery of physics had a profound effect on the discipline of philosophy. It confirmed modern philosophy, the modern philosophy articulated by Francis Bacon, or so the modern philosophers thought. Thus, after Newton's discovery of the laws of physics, modern philosophy blends Bacon and Newton together. This is the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. We are matter in motion. Everything is just matter in motion. Thus, modern philosophy drifts towards materialism and determinism. The materialism, determinism, and the belief that science and industry can remake nature form the basis for utilitarianism, the understanding of everything as ultimately being reduced to practical, material decision-making. The questions of good and evil that preoccupied the Greeks and Christians is now resolved simply by whatever is pleasing to the body and whatever can bring the most pleasure to the most bodies, because humans are nothing but material bodies. This, however, marks the end of rational contemplation. Yes, unlike the propagandist shills of the Enlightenment like Steven Pinker, modern philosophy actually marks the end of rational contemplation and thinking, because we know the answers to all the questions of philosophy through bodily utility and the materialist determinism that comes with the blending of Bacon and Newton together. Science has arrived and is the only game in town. Philosophy is now obsolete. Science is king. Not everyone agreed with this. The Counter Enlightenment in philosophy and the Romantic philosophical tradition protested this sterile understanding of the universe and humanity. As Rousseau famously declared in his Discourses on Inequality, science is not making us more moral, but is actually making us immoral. Science is not helping humanity, but harming humanity. The Romantics, too, famously storming onto the scene after Immanuel Kant, rediscovered the inner world of human passions and the human heart. The German Idealists wanted to recover the spirit of inner subjectivity given to us by Christianity, but synthesize it with the new discoveries of modern science. They wanted to resolve the dilemma of dualism and save us from the crude and vulgar materialism of utilitarianism. We have thus far said that modern philosophy becomes practical science. In this story, we have also said that modern philosophy turns away from intellectual contemplation in favor of bodily action. The idealist answer to the problems that have arisen in modern philosophy is to see inner nature and human subjectivity as a product of action and activity. This is the defining foundation of the most famous German idealists, like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Schelling would go as far as to say nature is action, since humanity is also action, humanity and nature are ultimately one, thus resolving, in Schelling's mind anyway, the separationist dualism of modern philosophy. Action, too, leads to the rise of human consciousness, per Fichte and Hegel. It is not the sterile contemplation of the self that leads to our understanding of ourselves, but the fusing of all human action and interaction that leads to our understanding, the understanding of ourselves, Hegel asserts. We must understand human action and human activity in this world in order to understand ourselves. Thus you can see how German idealism attempts to bridge the old philosophies with the new philosophy, and attempt to salvage the inner subjectivity given to us by Christianity, a preservation of some relationship to nature given to us by the Greeks, with the acceptance of the realities of movement, determined action, given to us by modern philosophy. This is why German idealism is still modern, rather than purely a return to Greek or Christian philosophy. Though most of the German idealists were schooled in the classics and theology, some of them being Protestant clergymen, they took from the Greeks, as mentioned, the theme of observable nature, and they took from the Christians the theme of the self, and they took from modern philosophy the theme of practical action and the discoveries of Newtonian physics, and tried to tie it all together into a systematic whole. German idealism attempted to marry intellectual contemplation with practical action, seeing the two as intimately intertwined. Eventually, though, German idealism floundered. The materialism of Bacon, Newton, and utilitarianism overran and outlasted what the historian Tom Blanning calls the Romantic Revolution. But a part of the idealist thesis that consciousness springs from human action was carried forward by the new materialists, Feuerbach, Marx, and Nietzsche. Modern philosophy is still the philosophy of practical science, but now it is becoming the philosophy of consciousness through practical science. The most famous representative of this idea is Karl Marx, who asserted that all human understanding derives from practical action, the practical action of economics. The ascendancy of Marx over the German idealist tradition turned German idealism into German materialism. This Marx left to the world in two of his most famous books, Das Kapital and the German Ideology. The materialization of German idealism by Feuerbach, Stirner, Marx, Nietzsche, and others ensured the death of the Romantic Revolution and its concern for inner subjective consciousness. It also ensured that modern philosophy would be defined by two poles: the practical utilitarianism of the Anglo-Scottish philosophies and the materialist consciousness of German or continental philosophy. These two philosophical schools, read through Marxist terms, would produce capitalism on one hand, the Anglo-Scottish philosophies, and scientific socialism on the other hand, the Marxist view, bourgeois liberalism, the Anglo-Scottish tradition, and proletariat communism, the Marxist tradition. In fact, from Marx, the world of materialist forces acting upon humanity and the scientific transformation of nature bifurcated humanity into these two groups, the capitalist and proletariat, the haves and the have-nots, the oppressor and the oppressed. This, though, ironically, marked the return of human contemplation. No more would philosophy simply be the practical application of science and industry to better improve our material comfort and security, as in utilitarianism. Philosophy would be concerned with understanding how materialist forces split humanity into two groups, the dialectic of Marxist class conflict. So while utilitarianism marks the end of philosophy and the triumph of practical science, Marx's materialization of subjective consciousness, stolen from Fichte and Hegel, would drive the rise of postmodern philosophy, which we shall cover next. But to summarize the modern period of philosophy, philosophy is no longer about the contemplative life as it was for the Greeks and Christians, nor is philosophy about the self and the inner world of human nature, as it was for Christianity. Philosophy is about the practical application of human reasoning to enhance one's material pleasure and comfort, the relief of man's estate, and the desire to establish the empire of man, as Francis Bacon said, through the rise of science, industry, and commerce. Modern philosophy becomes practical, and in becoming practical, modern science, which is practical science, eventually overtakes philosophy. Not everyone was happy with this direction. Those who were not happy rebelled. These are the Romantics and Idealists, whose famous names include Rousseau, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. But the Romantic and German Idealists' attempt to recover the questions of nature and the self failed with the rise of the German Materialists, most famous being Feuerbach and Marx. But what the German Materialists salvaged from their idealist forebears, this questioning of how the materialist forces of science bifurcated humanity into two groups, would lead to the final stage, the final chapter of philosophy, postmodernism and the deconstruction of practical science.